Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another one of these Corona for Cinema 4D physical material tutorials. In this one, we'll be using the Corona physical material to create this sort of a cool looking, slightly weathered metal material. Now, we won't fuss too much about creating a very specific metal material, such as, for example, aluminum or iron, and instead, we'll be more focused on the general workflow. So hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you'll have all the necessary knowledge to go out and start creating all kinds of different metal materials on your own. All right, okay, so we are in Cinema 4D, and as you can already see, we've already created a Corona physical material. We've already dragged it into the Corona Node Material Editor's canvas, and we've already applied it onto our hero object, which in our case here is going to be this little toy robot right here. Okay, so everything is good and set to go here. So, let's just go at it. So step number 0 for us here is going to be to name our material properly here, because organizing your scene is always a good idea. So let's go with a descriptive name here. Let's call this material metal material. Okay, then we can focus on the first step in the material creation process, which is to set the metalness mode here under the general tab here correctly. Okay, so this time around, we're not creating a non-metal material, and instead we're creating a metal material. So we're going to set our metalness mode here accordingly. Now, just as a bit of a refresher, what does this mode here do? What does this parameter here do? Well, it defines how your material will work like under the hood, and also how the UI itself will behave. Okay. Okay, so with that done, we can go under the base layer here and we can take a look at some of the most common parameters that you'll want to tweak for just about every metal material that you'll be creating. But before we actually go in here and we start moving all these sliders around, let's just first talk about a little bit of an elephant in the room, if you will. Okay, so now that we've switched our metalness mode here to metal, you're going to notice that the IOR parameter in here is going to get grayed out. And that is on purpose, and it's working as intended. And the reasoning here is that, well, metal materials are complex material, more complex than what most people think of them. Okay, and so this sort of simpler IOR parameter is not going to be describing them quite as accurately as we would want them. Okay, so that's why with the new Corona physical material, the IOR parameter is grayed out whenever you're creating a metal material. Now, we're going to be diving into why this is the case in a little bit more detail a bit later on. But, we just wanted to get this out there just so you aren't confused by, by seeing that the IOR parameter is unavailable to you, even though, we're creating a metal material. Okay, cool. So before we do anything else, let's also lower the roughness here to say maybe 10-ish or so percent, just so we get those reflections to start looking a bit more mirror-like. Okay, and with that done, let's now focus on the first parameter that you'll probably want to tweak for just about all the metal materials that you'll be creating, and that is the base layer's color parameter. Okay, so this parameter here is going to control the reflection strength for your metal materials, as well as the reflection color for your metal materials. Okay, so if we click on the input field here for the color, and if we start playing with the value parameter first, okay, you're going to see that if we start lowering the value parameter, our metal material will start becoming less and less reflective. Okay, the reflection strength will be lowered. Now, if we start upping the value parameter here, you're going to see that, well, our material is going to get more and more reflective. The reflection strength is going to be stronger. And that's how you control the reflection strength with the new Corona physical material whenever you're creating metal materials. You do that with this value parameter in here. Okay. Now, typically, if you're creating realistic metal materials, you'll want this value to be somewhere in between here. And you probably don't want to stick to extreme values, such as, for example, 100% or 0%. Okay. Now, how you fine tune this parameter here? Well, you look at your material references in real life, and you try to match that reflectivity. Okay. Now, That's how you control the reflection strength, right? But we also mentioned that you can control the reflection color in here as well. So if we start messing with the hue here just a little bit, right? And if we start adding saturation to our color, oh, well then, check that out. Now we're messing with the reflection color for our metal materials here. All right. So the workflow here is pretty straightforward and it should be really intuitive. So, you just choose the color you want, you play with the value to control that reflection strength, and whatever you're happy with, that's uh that's good then, right? So I'm pretty happy with this sort of brownish, bronzish color here. I think that's going to work well for us. So let's just close the color chooser here and let's focus on the next parameter that we have here, and that is the roughness parameter. Now, for this one, we don't need to talk about it too much. At this stage, we all know what it does. So if we start upping the roughness parameter, our reflections are going to get rougher. And if we start lowering the roughness parameter, well, then our reflections are going to get less rough. Now, what we want to do here is we want to plug in some sort of a map in here, some sort of an imperfection map. So we have this sort of dirt map prepared here. We're just going to plug it directly into the roughness slot. Okay. And then we're just going to fine tune the value here a little bit. So maybe a value of 30, 40% here will work fine for us. So let's just zoom in. Zoom out a little bit so we see a little bit more of our hero object here. And as you can see, we're doing what the roughness parameter always does. We're controlling the roughness of the reflections. Okay, so now that we've plugged in a map in here, some parts of our metal material here are rougher, other parts are less rough. Okay, so maybe this looks just a little bit too rough, so let's lower it down to maybe 33% or so, or maybe let's leave it at 35%. And yeah, that's the roughness parameter in a nutshell. Nothing new, essentially. Okay. Okay. Then we got the IOR and the edge color parameters, and we're going to talk about these two in tandem. So we already briefly touched on the fact that the IOR parameter, driven by that Fresnel curve, of course, is just a little too inaccurate to properly describe how metals behave in the real world. Okay, so metals have a certain base reflectivity to them, but then if you look at them from grazing angles, okay, so if you look at them more towards the edges, okay, you're going to see that they exhibit different reflection properties sometimes towards those edges. Okay, so towards the edges, some metals might be tinted a little bit differently. They also might be a little more or a little less reflective on those edges. Okay, and that's the IOR parameter is just not going to be describing that in as much detail as we want. So that's why, with the new corona physical material, the IOR parameter is grayed out because it's not adequate enough to perfectly describe metal materials. Okay, right. But so, what is the more precise way to describe metal materials then? Well, that's what the edge color parameter here will help you with essentially. Okay, so without saying much about it, let's just open up the color input field here. Let's bring up the color chooser, and then let's set the edge color, sorry, here to this really vivid green color. And immediately you're going to be able to see that now we're adjusting exactly what we just talked about a minute ago. We're adjusting how those edges behave, when you look at them from these sort of grazing angles, if you will. So right now we gave our edges this green color, sort of. We're also using a pretty high value for the color. So the green is really going to pop and it's going to look quite, well, green, as you can clearly see. But you can play around with this parameter as much as you want until you get a good visual result. So you can really dial in the look of those edges, you can change the color of those edges, and so on and so forth. Now, as always, you typically want to look at real world material references for this effect, okay? Maybe you want to consult some scientific analysis of how certain metal materials that you're working with behave, when you look at them towards the edges, if you will. And then you want to adjust the edge color here. Okay, so for our for our material here, I'm going to go with a slightly tinted and slightly less reflective edge color here. But again, it totally depends on the type of material that you're creating. And it's also perfectly fine, if you don't want to mess with this parameter, because a lot of metal materials um, also don't have, well, they don't exhibit very apparent qualities when you look at these edges. Okay, so even if you leave it at the default for a lot of materials, they're also going to be visually fine. But again, if you want that level of control with the edge color parameter, you now have it. Okay. Okay, so now that we know what the edge color parameter here does and why the IOR parameter itself is grayed out, let's talk a little bit about a set of parameters that we like to call the complex IOR parameters. Now you can locate those under the advanced menu. They're going to be right at the bottom here in this complex IOR compartment. If you enable this compartment, you're going to get access to all of these very scientific parameters. Okay. Now, with these parameters, you're going to be controlling the reflection strength of your metal materials. You're going to be controlling the reflection color of your metal materials. And then you're also going to be controlling how those edges behave on your metal materials. So you're going to be controlling all of that with this set of parameters right here. Right. So if we quickly go back to the base layer now, you're going to see that your base layer's color parameter will be grayed out, and so will be the edge color parameter. Okay, and again, that is because you're controlling all of that through these scientific parameters in here now. Okay. Okay, so how do you know which numbers to input in here? Well, if you frequent websites such as, for example, the refractiveindex.info, which stores a lot of these scientific measures of different metal materials, or if you frequent similar websites such as that one, well, you can get those numbers and you can just input them in here, and then you're going to be creating your metal material in a very scientific way. All right. Alternatively, you can just mess with the numbers here, but you're very quickly going to see that, this is a very unintuitive way of setting up your metal materials because you're just tweaking some seemingly random numbers here. Okay. And this is part of the reason why we would actually like to dissuade you from using the complex IOR workflow. Okay. Because as you can imagine, defining how your metal materials look like using the color parameters and the edge color parameters here, well, that's just a whole lot more intuitive and everything's just a whole lot easier to tweak. Okay, so if you want to change the reflection strength of your metal materials, well, just, lower the value in your base layer's color parameter. You want to play around with the colors? Play around with the colors. You want to fine tune things in the edge color parameter? Well, you can really fine tune it, right? Whereas with these values in here, well, that's a whole different story. Things get quite a bit more complex, if you will. Now, is there a big difference visually between using the complex IOR workflow and using this sort of non-complex IOR workflow? Well, no, both of these options uh, enable you to control how those edges behave. Both of these options enable you to control the reflection strength, and both of these options enable you to control the reflection color. Okay, so all those parameters are available to you. Now, yes, the complex IOR compartment here enables you to really be scientific about it and really, really precisely define your metal materials. Okay. But the visual differences are just going to be so negligible. Plus, again, tweaking things is just going to be a lot more intuitive using this workflow, the non complex IOR workflow here. Okay. So that's why we would like to dissuade you from using the complex IOR workflow. But if you do, for some reason, need to input the complex IOR values in here, well, you now can. Tweaking them is going to be a pain, but for those rare instances where you want to define your metals like this, well, you now can. All right. Okay. Cool. So now to finish off our material here, what we could also do is, we could, as always, we could bring in some bump imperfections, some bumps and bruises. We could plug this thing into the bump slot of our metal material here. We could enable that bump slot. And then this is probably just going to be a bit too intensive, so we could lower the value amount here. And, we could just be creative with it. All right. What we could also do is we could actually bring in some imperfections for the reflection, strength. Okay. So we have this dirt map prepared here. And if we plug it into the base layer's texture slot, okay, whoopsie, kind of dragged that into the wrong slot here. If we plug it into the base layer's texture slot here, Well, now we're going to be able to mix this imperfection map on top of this color here that we defined earlier, right? So if we set our mix mode here to say multiply, okay, now we're multiplying this texture map on top of this color. And as you can see, what we're doing essentially is we're saying, hey, certain parts of our metal material are going to be less reflective, as you can see here, right? And other parts are going to be very reflective. And again, you can be creative and just fine tune this thing, right? Maybe we are cool with a value of around 40% or so, you know, and so on and so forth. Now you can be creative and you can start tweaking things and adding even more details here. Now, just to quickly recap, what we've done here is, we first set our metalness mode here to metal, and then we've defined the reflection strength and the reflection color for our metal material here using the color parameter. Then we've also added some imperfections to it, and we've actually multiplied them on top of that color. Then we've added imperfections to the reflections, right, by using a roughness map, okay? And then we've also tweaked the edge colors, so that's that extra realism that we've added to our metal materials here using the edge color parameter. And last but not least, we've also played with the bump parameters so that we added some bumps and bruises. And just by, um, playing around with these basic parameters, this is the material that we've ended up with. And as you can see, you can really easily get to this cool looking metal material just by simply adjusting these couple of parameters in here. And that's how you create most, if not all, of your metal materials by playing around with these settings that we just showcased. Alrighty then, before we actually go on and we start concluding this tutorial, there's still one more very important topic that we still need to discuss, okay? And that is the fact that you can map the metalness parameter, okay? And you do that with the help of this texture slot right here. All right. Now, as you can see, we've already created a physical material. It was already applied to our hero object, which in our case here is going to be this tea kettle object. And the only thing that we've changed for our otherwise default physical material is that we lowered the roughness down to 0%, just because that'll help us explain a couple of things a little bit more clearly. Okay. Okay. So metalness. You can plug in a metalness map in the texture slot right here. And we have a metalness map prepared here. Let's open it up. Let's talk about it for just a second, okay? So a typical metalness map is going to look like this. It's going to be a black and white map, okay? So the white parts are going to be metal parts, and the black parts are going to be non-metal parts, okay? Now you can use gray values as well, but what that's going to do is it's actually going to tell the physical material to basically simply blend between a non-metal and a metal material. Now that's not going to be too physically realistic at all, but we still wanted to leave that option in there for you. But ultimately, the perfect or the proper metalness map is going to look like this. You're going to have parts of it that are going to be fully white and parts that are completely black. Okay. Now, there is a bit of a prerequisite typically to using metalness maps and this kind of a workflow, and that is, the fact that you need your objects to be properly UV unwrapped, because you're going to have, otherwise, you're going to have a bit of a hard time defining which parts of your object are going to be metal and which parts are not going to be metal. Okay, so your objects being UV unwrapped properly is typically a prerequisite for this type of a workflow. All right. Okay, cool. So now let's take this metalness map and let's plug it into the metalness texture slot in here. Okay, and as soon as we do that, you're going to see what's going to happen here is, well, probably what most of us here expected. So certain parts are now going to be metal, okay, and other parts are going to be non-metal. And that's exactly, what you would expect from this type of a metalness map. As you can see, certain parts are metal, other parts are non-metal. That's exactly what we see happening here. Okay. Now, as far as the parameters in here go in the base layer, you're going to see that now you have access to, well, pretty much all of the parameters in here. Okay. And the idea here is that for non-metal materials, these parameters are going to behave, well, like they would for non-metal materials. And for metal materials, all of these parameters are going to behave as they would for metal materials. Now, the IOR parameter is not going to do much. Well, it's not going to do anything for your metal materials because it's not relevant to metal materials. And the base color slot here, the base color parameter, is going to affect, the reflection strength and the reflection color of your metal parts. And for your non-metal parts, it's just going to, affect its color. Okay, so that's how that works. And so typically at this stage, what you would want to do is you would want to plug in some sort of a base color map. And we have one prepared, and typically, it'll look like this. So certain parts here are wooden. Okay, so these are non-metal parts. These other parts, if you'll remember, if we take a look at our metalness map, these are also non-metal parts. They have this blue color with some imperfections on them. And then for our metal parts, okay, these white parts here, these are these guys right here. Okay, and as you can see, they're desaturated, which immediately tells us that these metal materials are not going to have any color to them. And they're also not fully white, which means they won't be super duper reflective, okay? They're going to be a little bit toned down in terms of their reflection strength, okay? Because that's what we're defining with this map, okay? So for non-metal parts, we're defining their color, but for metal parts, well, yes, we're defining their color, but also their reflection strength. All right, so let's plug in this color map here into the base layers texture slot. Okay, and again, immediately you see what's going to happen is, now our metal parts are going to get slightly dimmer. Okay, because, we're using this sort of gray color to define them. Okay, and, the rest of the parts are going to be, well, blue, as you would expect, right? Blue, and then wooden, as you would expect, because, that's what we saw in our base color map here. Okay, at this point, this is not really looking too convincing because, this wood material on top here is super reflective. It's super glossy, super not rough. Okay, so you want to plug in a roughness map at this point as well. Now, the roughness map, again, it will differentiate between metal parts, okay, and non-metal parts. So in our case here, if we break things down a little bit more in detail, we have our wood material here, as you can see, right? So if we bring up the other map, all right, these are the wood parts. So as you can see, they have their own roughness property, okay, and their own sort of roughness texture, okay. And the other non-metal parts, they have their own imperfections. So just immediately by looking at this map, the wood's going to be a bit rougher than these other parts, which are going to be a bit more glossier, if you will. Now, as far as our metal parts go, so these guys right here, right? Well, check this out. They're pretty much completely black here, okay? And what that means is that, they're not going to be rough at all. All right, so let's plug in this roughness map into the roughness slot here. And let's also make sure that we're mixing this map 100% on top of our roughness value. Okay, so basically that we're using this map here instead of the roughness value. Okay, so now you're going to see that, well, this wooden part here has, wooden roughness, if you will. It doesn't look as glossy as it did before. These base parts have their own imperfections, okay, to the reflections, and the reflections are just a little bit less mirror-like. And then as far as the metal parts go, because of the roughness map, where they're completely sort of black, dark, well, they have very mirror-like reflections. Okay? Okay. And in a nutshell, that is how you use, the metalness map. All right. So typically, this is the most useful for when you're dealing with unwrapped objects and they're not split. Okay. So as you can see, this tea kettle is just one mesh, but it has many different parts that are, some of them are non-metal, some of them are metal. Well, in those cases, this workflow can come really in handy. And again, all you need is the proper roughness map, sorry, the proper metalness map, some sort of a base color map, okay, and then a roughness map. Okay, so with that, we'll be concluding this tutorial. We hope you've learned something new, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.